Leadership USA's monthly Facebook Live discussion series. I'm Dr. Zaria Davis, Senior Associate with Pretrial Justice Institute, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. Just Leadership USA is dedicated to decarcerating the United States by educating, elevating, and empowering the people and communities most impacted by systemic racism, to drive, amplify, and sustain the kind of policy reform that builds thriving and sustainable as well as healthy communities. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as SNAP, and the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, also known as TANF, programs both provide much needed assistance, equal opportunity, and stability for millions of marginalized people and communities. However, those with drug felony convictions are often denied the same rights and are shut out from some of the most basic means of survival. So today we are joined by some awesome panelists, which I'm excited to introduce now. Grant Smith. Grant Smith is Deputy Director of the National Affairs with the Drug Policy Alliance. Welcome, Grant.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, we also have Lauren Johnson, Policy and Advocacy Strategist with the ACLU of Texas. Welcome. And then we have Sue Berkowitz, who is an attorney and director of South Carolina Appleseed Legal Justice Center. Welcome to all of our panelists. I am so looking forward to being with you all today and just really being a part of this conversation and learning more and making sure that those who are listening have the opportunity to really not only learn more about this issue, but also to identify ways that they can engage in this space. So as we get started today, I want to just start with looking at the background around the creation of this ban and what it has done to really have an impact since it was introduced in 1996. So we're going to start with Lauren. And what I'm going to ask each of the panelists to do is to just describe a little bit more about their work. I gave their titles, but a little bit more about your work and then just a little bit more detail around the background around the creation of this ban.
Okay, so I'll kick it off with the background piece first. So as you mentioned, in 1996, Bill Clinton was in office. And one of several big things that he did was the Personal Work and Responsibility Act. And this is just your friendly reminder that it doesn't matter which side is in power, we still have work to do no matter what. You can't make assumptions based on what party somebody's with, what kind of policies they're going to pass. And so this Personal Work and Responsibility Act was a huge welfare reform act. And at the last minute, they tacked on an amendment that banned for life anybody that had a felony drug conviction on their record. And at the time, their thinking was that people were out here trading food stamps to get drugs, which sure, it's a thing that happens, but so that was their thinking, that people that were on drugs that we could prove had a drug history would be banned for life from receiving food stamp assistance. And so this immediately impacted many, many people all over the nation. And I remember at the time hearing about it being passed and thinking how unfair it was and how it wasn't right, but never not having any idea that there was something that could be done about that. And over time, so each state had an opportunity to opt out of this law or modify it to suit their state, but it had to be done legislatively. And so over the years, state by state, either modifications or reinstatements of, undoing that harm have happened. And then that kind of leads into kind of my entry into this fight. In 2011, I had just came home from my last time in prison and kind of by accident fell into advocacy. I had gone to the Capitol to stop my water rates from going up. I live 8 miles from the Capitol. I didn't know what happened in that building, didn't think it impacted me, didn't think I could impact it, but I showed up to this water hearing and saw those representatives actually fighting for the people and not companies, which apparently is a rare thing, but it just inspired me. And so the next day I called, and the very first thing that one of the offices told me when I said I wanted to change a law, where do I start? They had me go listen to Michelle Alexander when she came to Austin to speak about the new Jim Crow book. that she was currently touring at the time. And so, going to hear her speak and kind of understanding the historical context of this law and how it impacted communities kind of gave me my next steps for what I could do to go fix it. And then I started plugging in with community groups here in Austin that had, at the time, I didn't know anything about any of this. Didn't even think that maybe somebody else had already been working on this for a decade. And it took 2 sessions after I started working on it, but we changed that law in Texas so that people with felony drug convictions could have that privilege, have that support restored. And the year before we passed that law, so this had been enacted in 1996, we changed the law in 2015. The year before we passed that law, 54,000 people had been denied access to SNAP benefits based on a past conviction. That doesn't include all of the people that just don't even bother applying anymore because they already knew the law. So it's a huge impact. I'm happy to kind of give more of the nuts and bolts and intricacies of the story, but I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to go.
Thank you so much for giving that background. I think it's really important for people to understand like when this started and the context of how it got started. So I appreciate that. So I'm going to go to Grant next and just ask to share a little bit about the work that you are currently doing.
Well, thank you. Yes. So, my role at Drug Policy Alliance is to advocate on Capitol Hill and with the administration, with the White House, for an end to the war on drugs and health-based approaches to drugs. The Drug Policy Alliance works to end punitive approaches to drugs and end the war on drugs and find effective alternative approaches to drug use that apply a health-based approach. We work to reduce harms associated with drugs, as well as, end the devastation and the harm and the dehumanization that comes from, harsh punitive approaches to drugs and crime more broadly. And so, my role over the last number of years has been to basically strive to represent people who are directly impacted by these punitive policies, people who are dehumanized, people who are, victimized by the criminal legal system, and people who use, and as well as represent people who use drugs and ensure that policies are advanced that reflect efforts to protect the health and welfare of people who use drugs, as well as people who are, as I said, people who are impacted by the criminal legal system. I think to add to Lauren's, her reflections on what happened in 1996, essentially this was an era where dozens of similar collateral consequences of criminal conviction, like the SNAP and TANF drug felony ban, were passed by lawmakers in Congress under the assumption, as Lauren said, that there's some kind of nefarious activity going on with public assistance. But I think there was a deeper sort of motive, and that was to really act upon deeply entrenched stigma against people who struggle with poverty. I think there was also a real motivation to essentially vindictively punish people who are convicted of a drug offense. The belief was that if we heap punishment after punishment on people, somehow that might dissuade people from using drugs or getting involved in illicit drugs. Of course, it wasn't long after these laws passed. Even then, people were arguing that's not going to work, and of course, it hasn't worked. It's made, it's been hugely counterproductive, which we'll talk about more. But I just want to underscore that this was one of a series of laws that was passed that banned people from federal assistance of different types, housing, financial assistance with college, student aid, the list goes on. And so I think it's just important to recognize this was part of a years long effort that we're still working to unravel and still working to repair. So we'll talk about that more, I'm sure.
All right. Thank you so much, Grant, for sharing about your work, as well as just giving a little bit more background. We really appreciate that. Sue, tell us about South Carolina Appleseed Legal Justice Center and the work you all are doing there.
Well, South Carolina Appleseed, we're a multi-issue advocacy organization, and our mission is to work on behalf of and with low-wealth felony and to fight against economic, legal, and social injustice. And so our work really spans a lot of the issues that were just already discussed, everything from criminal justice reform to income maintenance and income assistance, hunger, immigrants' rights, consumer protection, issues that impact the low wealth community. And back in 95 and 96, I was working actually directly on, as they were reforming welfare in South Carolina, we jumped the gun and actually put restrictions on time limits and ability for families to add children onto the household for TANF benefits. And I'm so sorry. I thought y'all lost my feed. We're having a little trouble here with our Wi-Fi, and working on issues that during the mid 90s to time limit welfare benefits and time and also put restrictions on the SNAP program, as well as SSI and housing and a number of the benefits. And a lot of that I attribute to so much of the programs that came out of that era as basically responses and address because of racism. When talking and working on a state level as well as a federal level about work requirements or who we were going to limit from getting certain benefits, there were always assumptions made, and also the individuals and those who were trying to make things move forward in both Congress and on a state level, they were doing it to punish people for being low income instead of addressing the real reasons why people were struggling and living in poverty, and addressing the racial barriers and the historic racism. Instead, we put additional barriers up, meaning we, the state and the federal government, to punish people even further instead of being honest and addressing the reasons why people were struggling.
Thank you so much for sharing that and lifting that up. I'm going to go back to Lauren. I know Lauren started speaking about her work in Texas, and I just wanted to just open it up for you to speak a little bit more about the successes that you all have had, or any other things that you wanted to mention.
Yeah, so I think what I would say is, kind of reflecting back on my journey and doing this advocacy. In the very beginning, like I said, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how this law came to be or how to undo it. I didn't realize in the beginning that this was a state level fight. In the beginning, I was thinking that I was going to have to go to Capitol Hill. And, just kind of did whatever I could think of to do. I created a petition on change.org. I put my name on the list with a couple of advocacy organizations. And at one point we had a journalist that contacted the advocacy organization and got my name and asked if he could come and interview me. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to change this policy. So as much as I can do. And so this man asked me when he could come to my home, and I was thinking, in a few days, and he was like, I can be there in 30 minutes. So I rushed around to clean my house and came upstairs and printed all this information because I wanted to give him the meaty substance of what it looks like for a family that is struggling for food. And if you have to go to a food bank to supplement your eating, then here's what that looks like. And if you're on a bus, here's what that looks like. And here are the days and the hours that you're restricted to. And if you only live in this zip code, then you can get served. And And just wanted to paint a picture of like how that actually keeps people trapped in poverty, because if you're spending all of your time meeting your basic needs, then you don't have the capacity to do a job search or do other things that would be more meaningful. And I think that that's the tragedy of laws that passed like this in that era, was that, you know, they wanted to restrict it. They didn't want people living on welfare for the rest of their lives. But at the same time, the rules that they enacted to prevent that actually keep people stuck, because there's not a ladder out. It's just either you're stuck here or you're not here. So you either get support or you don't. And there's no kind of in between to transition people out of that system. And so, you know, when the guy came to do the interview with me, I presented all of this substantive information. And then when I saw what he had done for the media spot, it was largely like one snippet of me saying something important, and mostly my kids shoving biscuits in their face. And when I read the comments, and there were comments about, oh, she doesn't need food stamps, look at those rings on her fingers. And so just kind of, I mean, that was very illuminating for me in the beginning of my journey to understand like what the perceptions are about this and how people misunderstand like what's at stake. And I'll tell you that the first session that I went to go do advocacy around this, I had an advocate that had contacted me and said, I want you to go and meet the committee members. And I remember being terrified, but I paid for childcare so that I could go up to the Capitol. I went into the first office and she says, hi, I'm here to talk to you about this bill and why I think it's important, and we sure hope that you'll support it. And then we walked out of that office and went into the next office, and she looked at her watch and said, oh no, I'm late for a meeting. Here's the list of offices. Good luck. And so you know, talking about food stamps when you have a criminal background is like the epitome of the shame and guilt ball, right? Mm-hmm. And in Texas, which is like, looks down on social benefits and criminal backgrounds. And so I'm going into this office. And so I thought it would be more appropriate for me to share as a professional person. And so I pretended like I was there in some kind of official, I mean, I didn't lie, but I didn't tell my truth either. Mm-hmm. And I went into the office and the guy said, well, I'll see how my boss feels about it. Check back with me next week. And just as I was about to leave his office, he said, but what's to stop those people from just living on welfare? And I really didn't know how to answer that question because I was pretending to be somebody else. But the following week, when I went back, I said, let me explain to you why this is important. My husband and I both have felony drug convictions. When we needed assistance for a couple of months because he lost his job. They gave me a card for my children, but less money for my household. And you know, we eat the same food. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense that my whole family is paying for something that I already paid for. And I don't think that their office was originally supportive, but this guy sat down and listened to me in a way that he had not the time before. And it was kind of that moment of understanding that, you know, what you do today, you don't always get a gold star for that unless people know what you had to go through to get there. And so those are just some of my big lessons that came out of that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think it's so important, like what you lifted up as it relates to centering the voices of the people that are impacted and really being able to tell those stories. I think that oftentimes, you know, there are these, you know, there are these perceptions of like who a formerly incarcerated person is or what a person who's, you know, has a conviction acts like or does. And so in the work that you're doing, you're able to have that voice and really be able to advocate for people who may not be in those spaces. So I just want to say thank you and, you know, lift that up in what you shared with us. So I'm going to just ask for the people who are watching, if there are questions or if you have any comments, please feel free to drop those in. Towards the end of this, we will have a time where we can do Q&A from the audience. So I just want to lift that up. As we move on, we're going to talk about what are like the next steps to addressing the harm caused by this particular ban. And so I want to start with Sue and just give you an opportunity to speak to that. So addressing the harm that is caused and what are going to be our next steps.
Well, I guess it makes sense for me to go next because South Carolina is the last state in the the nation that still has the ban. Our legislature has not voted to repeal the felony conviction ban. And part of that is because of exactly what Lauren was saying, a total lack of understanding and empathy, and recognizing that somebody who is formally incarcerated for a drug felony has, first of all, they've already addressed it and provide, either did time or other penalties. And because someone has that conviction doesn't mean that they still don't have a family. They're still not trying to address the needs of the family. And that there are times when all of us run into rough times and need help. And making somebody go hungry does not necessarily make the difference of undoing what happened in the past. And so we have two things that we'd like to see happen in South Carolina. One, I would like to see our legislature repeal this. And there is a bill that has been filed. Our SNAP, I'm so old, I still call it food stamps. Our SNAP agency is, for the first time, being supportive, and I think a little embarrassed that we're the last state that still has this full ban for both SNAP and for TANF. We had tried to do it quietly in criminal justice reform because those who were working in criminal justice reform recognized that this policy had nothing to do with what happened in someone's past and was not going to help somebody move forward with this ban in place. But the other piece of it is, and I'm very excited, is that there may be an effort to actually get this taken out of the federal law. I would like to see all of PERORA rescinded because of so many of the things and the assumptions that are made and things that are projected by those who passed that law onto people who need the services and benefits that both TANF and SNAP, SSI, housing, all of them are needed for people when they are suffering from tough times. But I would like to see this ban removed, because in some states it's not a full removal of the ban, and in states like ours it's still there. And I think just the idea of what it stands for and the recognition that it is not only not needed, it is unjust, needs to have it removed from our federal laws.
Thank you so much. And as we talk about the federal laws, Grant, can you speak to advocacy around this on a federal level? Just kind of expand.
Absolutely. Well, first I want to just acknowledge the hard work that Lauren did in Texas and the hard work that Sue is doing now in states and your respective states, and the work that's been done over the years in many states to effectively opt out, in some cases altogether, and other cases partially, from this ban. As Sue mentioned, this is a policy that when it was enacted in 1996 that enables states to opt out. Unfortunately, as Sue mentioned, many states have not fully opted out. Some have. And we're aware that, especially during this pandemic and economic downturn, that individuals and families have been extremely hard hit by this SNAP and TANF drug felony ban. Even in ordinary times, an individual with a criminal record faces daunting odds in terms of finding employment and finding other sort of basic needs. Mm-hmm. And so having this, very basic assistance in place, SNAP and TANF, to help individuals meet those basic needs so they can spend more time looking for employment, looking for housing, and looking for other, critical supports, so they can, be more successful in terms of being prosperous, being able to, in some cases, many cases, be able to no longer require this assistance in the future. That's what we really need. Is we really need to ensure that these supports are in place. I think, at the federal level, we've had, as has been the case at the state level, sort of the combination of stigma and stereotypes that people tend to carry when it comes to people who have a criminal conviction, as well as stigma and stereotypes about people who are in need of basic assistance like SNAP and TANF. And so when you have those two factors together, along with racism, as Sue very eloquently highlighted, this is really, we're talking about an issue of we're talking about really racism that has sort of really helped, really sort of led to, in many respects, sort of shaped and led to this policy to begin with, and has sort of, I think, sort of contributed or led, sort of propelled the sort of these sort of views, right, that have kept this policy in place for 26 years. So it is an uphill climb at the federal level to address this. At the same time, since the pandemic began, the Drug Policy Alliance has helped to organize a broad coalition of stakeholders, as well as a coalition of lawmakers on Capitol Hill, to really push very hard for this to be finally repealed. We really feel like it's the responsibility of Congress to take this away. They imposed this back in 1996, and they have the responsibility to take this away, so that we can provide relief to individuals all over the country who have not benefited from a full opt-out. And that's in a number of states. I think it's roughly 25 states that have not fully opted out of the SNAP ban or the TANF ban or both. And so, we have a lot of people who are being impacted. Lauren, I think, Lauren, you mentioned that was, or maybe Sue, I can't recall now, 54,000 people. I think, Lauren, you mentioned that, right, when you did a survey earlier. 54,000 people. I mean, imagine that. That's 54,000 individuals, in many cases with families, in many cases women, who are disproportionately incarcerated more now for drug crimes than men, as well as people of color who are being harmed, being denied basic assistance, being forced to go food insecure because of this, policy that harkens to a different time. But yet, again, still, we still encounter a lot of resistance at the federal level. So, we have been pushing for a repeal or at least a waiver during the pandemic. Now that we're looking ahead, we are looking for introduction of legislation in this Congress, this new Congress, and with this new administration, that would fully repeal this ban, right? That would enable Congress to act on the responsibility they have to take this away. The legislation is titled the Making Essentials Affordable and Lawful Act, otherwise known as the MEAL Act, and all it would do is it would repeal this 1996 ban on SNAP and TANF for people with a drug felony conviction, and it would also enable individuals who are incarcerated to apply for SNAP assistance and get that up and going before they're released as well. So it's that's the measure that we expect will be introduced in the coming weeks, and I'm happy to talk more, answer questions about sort of what that advocacy looks like in the coming in the coming year. But we are going to continue to push very hard at the federal level for this lift.
Thank you. Thank you for just giving us that update, and we will definitely be on the lookout for that. And we want to encourage people to follow that and really read into it and be in a place to be able to advocate for that to be repealed. Absolutely. So I know you all mentioned a few times the issue around race and identity. And so I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts as far as when we look at this, how much do you think race and identity has really played on this issue and continues to play on this issue at this time? And this is open to anyone that might want to take that.
I would be glad to jump in on that. I mean, I think all of the policies that came out of Perora were absolutely a reflection of racism, and whether it's limiting the size of a family because there was an assumption that individuals who needed assistance, public assistance, were having more children for additional dollars, to trying to determine a way to punish people the most they could, like with the drug felony ban. And I think it would be hard pressed, and thank goodness we're in a time where we can talk openly about this, and frankly about why certain policies have been enacted in our country, so that we can have the discussion and look to see why we are not walking those policies back, and recognizing that the full reason they came forward is because of racism, including still the efforts of trying to put work requirements on your ability to eat, and in just until recently, in order to get health care, there's still hopefully a case that's going to be withdrawn from the U.S. Supreme Court, but recognizing that people who need health care should not be being forced to work before they can get health care, that if people have health care, they're able to work. And I think all of that has a racial bias and a racial reason why they've been enacted or proposed.
Thank you, Sue. Would any of the other panelists be interested in sharing their thoughts about that?
I mean, the thing that comes up for me is thinking, this goes well beyond even Reagan, but back when Reagan was in office, there was an image of the welfare queen, and people have a perception of people that are on welfare, that people need those supports, are people of color. And the statistics show that that is not true. It is mostly white people that are accepting this assistance. And so, I think that because that perception exists, that is one of the ways in which the systemic racism has kind of driven these policies to be able to be implemented in the first place. I think if our Congress and the White House, through any administration, had the perception that it was our white people on support, they wouldn't have passed laws like that. Yeah. There's one other thing that I wanted to say, and that's like not just the poor outcomes that this creates, but like there were a lot of unintended consequences that came about through this. And I remember when I first created that petition, I found some stories in there. There was one woman that was a first responder in Katrina and had since had severe health issues. She was on an oxygen tank. She lived in an RV trailer. And her criminal background was 20 years old. But now she's an elderly person with a lot of healthcare needs that would otherwise qualify for assistance, but didn't because of that law. Similarly, there was a woman that I met that had been a journalist, like she had lived the right way or whatever, and wound up getting a charge from her boyfriend leaving something in her car. Did probation for the charge, successfully completed a 10-year term of probation, and then wound up getting hit by a motorcycle and had a brain injury. And the people at SSI automatically applied for her to get food assistance, and she qualified and she got that food assistance. And then a month later, they contacted her and said, "Oh, you're not actually allowed to get this because of this background that you have." And so, this woman that can't get on a bus system because she's got a traumatic brain injury that doesn't allow her short-term memory to function the way everybody else's does. Like, how does she go to a food bank? What happens to her? And so, when I did a talk shortly after we changed the law, I went into a class at UT, and I had asked people in the beginning of the class, would anybody here be willing to admit that you know somebody that's been incarcerated? And one person raised their hand. And then after I talked about my experience and what had happened, a woman came up to me at the end of class and was like, "I just want to say thank you because my mom took a charge from my uncle, and she's elderly and she needs that help and she couldn't get it. And so now she can." And she was crying. And so that stigma is real. And, there are just so many stories out there that are heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for just sharing and lifting up those stories as well. I think it's important to put those stories, with this issue. A lot of times, we don't understand the reality of how it impacts people, or we have like a certain stigma or stereotype, as you mentioned, that that's related to getting that assistance. But there are people out there that really need the help. And I'm just grateful that you all are in this space doing this work. So I want to move on to the next question, which is, this is open to all three, and we can start with Grant and then go to Sue and then Lauren. What do you all think are the driving points as far as resistance to repealing this? So what's driving the resistance from people wanting this repealed on a federal level and then even on a state level?
Well, thank you, Dr. Davis. I mean, I think, Lauren spoke to it really, really clearly. I mean, I think it's a lack of understanding about how people are really being impacted by this policy, combined with really sort of a dehumanization of people who are being denied eligibility by this longstanding lifetime ban that's been in place since 1996. I think it's really people in power largely continue to have entrenched views that have been shaped by racism, by stereotypes, by stigma, both towards people who have a criminal conviction or who have been impacted by the criminal legal system, as well as by people who are eligible for SNAP and TANF, but are otherwise denied access. And so I guess I would just say that. I just also wanted to make, sort of build on something that Lauren said about the perception that, individuals who qualify for SNAP and TANF are predominantly people of color. Another thing is that back in the 90s, and I think this is still true today, a lot of lawmakers assume that people of color use drugs at higher rates than whites, but actually the reverse. But that's not true. Whites use whites and people. It's basically similar use rates, right? But I think that also informed the policy discussions and sort of informed the push to impose this ban in the first place back in 1996. The assumption that, again, racism, right? The assumption is that people of color are using drugs more. The assumption also, as Lauren said, that people of color qualify for welfare, more, and so therefore we're going to punish them in this way. And so I just wanted to just add that from the early discussion.
Thank you. Any other thoughts around resistance to appealing this ban?
I think for a lot of our policymakers, it's a lack of being personally touched by what it means to be going hungry, or what it means to have not allowing forgiveness for making a mistake. And, that's what the bottom line is of why we keep laws like this in place, is because there is a lack of forgiveness. It reminds me of, at one point, we were contacted by a circuit court judge here in South Carolina, and circuit court in general sessions, that's where for drug felonies people are charged. Well, that's where they would be tried and convicted. And a young man had pled guilty in front of him for a drug offense, and he convicted him, and because he pled guilty, and sentenced him. And then later encountered this young man and learned that because of the drug conviction, he was not going to be able to get SNAP. And this judge actually reached out to us because he was just appalled that there would even be a law that would, or something in South Carolina that would keep somebody from being able to get SNAP, because this young man had served his time, had done, had fulfilled his obligation for the conviction, and yet he was going to be forced to go hungry. And we had already done the research to determine that there was not a legal challenge, so we weren't going to be able to litigate this. And, I think that, he was ready to do whatever it took to try to undo this law in South Carolina. We just could not get the political will to move forward. But I think that that's what it really takes, is for us to be speaking out about this, and for people to realize it could be your neighbor. It could be your son. It could be your daughter. And that we should be showing forgiveness, and none of us are perfect. And, why should we not be showing grace and forgiveness for folks? And causing people to go hungry is absolutely the wrong solution for this issue.
Absolutely.
So I would just tell a slightly removed story that I think really illustrates the point. And that is that we did a stakeholder meeting with women who were currently incarcerated. Now we had this same stakeholder meeting on the outside with, academics and experts and all these people to come up with what does a model facility look like. And I know that that's going to ruffle some feathers for the abolitionist movement, but they were going to build a jail, and we were trying to get them to build it in a way that was gender responsive, instead of just, giving the women the crappy buildings and the leftovers. And so we convinced them to let us do a focus group inside of the jail. Now, when we did our stakeholder groups on the outside, the facilitators started us off and said, dream big. What does it look like? And I said, oh, it's got a swimming pool and a movie theater. Like you said, no limits. I'm going to dream big. And so when we went into the jail, we did the same thing. We said, what does a model facility look like? And in 3 separate groups of women that had not talked to each other, we heard very similar things from each group. And it always started off with their most basic needs. And it was, can I work for deodorant? Or, if I could have access to healthy food, or, if just your most basic needs, underwear, tampons, deodorant, shampoo, food, healthy food. And then I'd say, okay, that's all really great. What else? What does it look like? What does it offer you? And every group, those women would hit a wall, and you would hear some version of, this is supposed to make me not want to come back. I don't want my grandkids thinking that this is some vacation to go on. Like, you're supposed to be punished here. And so I had to challenge them with this idea that, like, has that worked for you? Because, there are places in Norway that actually support people into succeeding instead of punishing them to not come back. And how would that be different? And what would that look like for you? And I think that it just, for me, really illustrated this idea that people can't transform their lives if their most basic needs aren't being met. And I think that, we have this idea of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but if people's basic needs aren't being met, they don't have the capacity to have time for self-awareness and self-care and all this hoity-toity stuff that people that are in a better position get. And so, just meeting people's basic needs, I think there's a misconception that people want to live, they just want to exist and they don't want to do anything with their lives, and they just want to take. And that's not my experience with most people. The other, reentry simulations, poverty simulations, I think that those exercises are really useful to getting people to come around, because even though it's just a game, like the pressure of trying to play a game that's rigged against you, and like really understanding how stressful that is in a 15-minute segment, much less in an everyday life, could be something that we can do to help kind of bring people around.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned that. I just did one of those last week with the group here in my area, and it was an eye opener for people. They're just like, they didn't even understand like the time crunches, and just you can't get to here unless you have this, and just all the different barriers when a person is re-entering. So thank you. So as we start getting close to the end here, we want to talk about call to action. So how can we increase the public understanding of the real world impact of this ban? And then what are some suggestions that you all have as far as how people can get involved in advocacy around this? And so we'll start with Sue.
Well, clearly for folks in South Carolina, we would love for them to, one, reach out to us, because we do have a bill that has been introduced by Senator McLeod, and with joined voices, and for folks to talk to their legislators and tell their story and explain why having someone go hungry is not going to be a solution to helping somebody be able to succeed. And that this is something that this was a law that was passed during a different era when maybe we didn't understand as well. I will give that grace, that maybe we didn't understand as well why we were passing laws like that, but the time has come for that law to be lifted. And also to work with national groups like Just Leadership and Jails USA and DPA, if there are federal solutions, to be able to also use your voice and use your story to help make changes on a federal level as well.
Thank you. Grant, how can people get involved with advocacy around this?
Absolutely. Well, I would just echo what Sue said about lending your voice to the federal advocacy efforts. I think, we have a lot of stakeholders involved in pushing for legislation like the Meal Act, which would repeal this lifetime ban at the federal level, but we don't have many voices in terms of people who have lived experience with this, with being impacted by this ban. We don't have many voices in terms of people who know other people who have been impacted. And so I think, that is really critical to personalize and humanize this issue for lawmakers. As Sue mentioned, it can easily be your neighbor, right? It can be, someone next, it can be a family member, right, who's impacted, who's convicted of a drug felony. At the end of the day, we're talking about substance use disorders. Substance use disorder knows no barriers. It affects everyone. And unfortunately, we treat substance use, illicit drug use, as a crime, and that in of itself creates a lot of stigma, but also it criminalizes people. And so the likelihood that people will become encounter law enforcement is high in this country, especially people of color who are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement. So, and therefore disproportionately impacted by this ban. So I think, the call to action, as I see it, is, really looking for, people who are willing to help and willing to be centered in advocacy on Capitol Hill, to talk about, how they've either been personally impacted or how someone they know has been impacted. That will really help to really bust through some of this stigma and some of these stereotypes that I think we've been talking about today when it comes to people who have been made ineligible by this policy.
Thank you. And Lauren, again, how can we increase the public understanding of this, as well as how can people get involved?
Well, I still live in Texas, and I can tell you that every session that I have been involved in the legislature, there has been a bill that seeks to put people's photo on their SNAP card and a statement at the bottom that says paid for by taxpayers. There has also been a bill every session trying to enact drug testing for benefits, which is largely unsuccessful. It's when I first started working on this, that was kind of my spiel, was that just let me prove to you that I'm not using, I'll take a drug test. And then somebody said, do you know where the money comes from for the drug testing? And by the way, have you ever passed a drug test when you were using? And I was like, oh, yeah, I guess I have. Okay, that doesn't make sense. I think I'd rather just feed people instead of wasting money to find out if they're using drugs, and then what do we have to offer them if that's the case? And so, anyway, call to action is plug in with groups. If you live in a state so I'm sure that DPA probably has information on their website. Sentencing Project also has information on their website about which states have fully opted out and which states have just modified their ban, and how those modifications work. Texas was one that modified it. It captures most of the people and allows them to get it. But if you get another felony drug conviction while you're receiving food stamp assistance, they can again ban you for life. And so, we're ready for the next generation of advocates to come up and say, no, this isn't okay, and to lead that fight here. But also, whatever state you're in, find the organizations that have been working on this for 2 decades. And plug in with them and, get started to help make that change in your local community, because that's how we make change in the bigger nation.
Thank you. Thank you. So I was looking in the chat just to see if we had any questions, and I didn't see any questions pop up. So what I want to do is give you an opportunity to, one, share like how people can get in contact with you or the organizations that you all work with, as well as any final thoughts that you each may have. And then after that, we're actually going to present the Just Us live animation video for the first time. We're doing a premiere during our panel. So want to just let you all have just final thoughts as we before we go into the video, and then again, how people can reach out to you. And we'll start with Grant.
Well, thanks, Dr. Davis. Folks are welcome to reach out to me by email. It's gsmith@drugpolicy.org, gsmith@drugpolicy.org if you're interested in being in touch about federal advocacy efforts on this issue. We are expecting to have a very active session this year, working to push for this repeal, and we'll need all the help we can get. It's just been a real pleasure to be with all of you today, and thank you so much for tuning in for this.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your voice and just the amazing work you're doing. I had the pleasure of working with Grant on some other things, so I know he's doing amazing work in DC. So Lauren, how can people get in contact with you, and any final thoughts that you may have for us today?
So I am here doing the Lord's work at the ACLU of Texas. You can find my contact info at aclutx.org. Currently working on the George Floyd Act and reducing penalties for drug possession. It's a crazy session, but if you are in Texas and you want to get involved, that's where I would start. And then I can help plug you into whatever the thing is that you're interested and passionate about helping to change.
Thank you, Lauren. And Sue, we're going to wrap up with you. So final thoughts, and then how can people get in contact with you?
Well, we are in session right now, so I would suggest going to our website, which is scjustice.org. And you can find my contact information on there. And we work on numerous issues ranging from housing to hopefully positive changes to the criminal justice system, juvenile justice system, hunger issues. And we need everybody's. We can't do this for folks. We do this with folks. And so we look forward to hearing from you and working with you. And please reach out, and we will also help you plug into the issues that you find most important and you're most passionate about.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So what we're going to do next is we are going to go to our Just Us live animation video. Again, this is the premiere. Woo. So we want to go ahead and kick that off, and then we will be closing out. I think it's going to take a minute to pull this up here. So
I'm going to do a drum roll.
I know. Mm-hmm. Everybody prepare. Get it all set. All right, so we're going to allow him to get this set up really quickly.
In the United States is facing a health crisis. A crisis that has already killed so many and is getting worse. And for those incarcerated, the risk is even greater. Emergency management in prisons and jails where people live and work together has always been overlooked. Because of this, incarcerated people have always been the most vulnerable to pandemics, natural disasters, and climate change. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, there was an evacuation plan for stray cats and dogs, but not for incarcerated people. Neglecting the safety of millions of incarcerated people and people who work in correctional facilities during times of crisis is a denial of human rights. This failure to protect disproportionately Black and brown incarcerated people demonstrates the United States' 400-year legacy of slavery and discrimination, and it also reflects how marginalized people and communities are still abused in the United States today. The truth is, states have no plans to save the lives of incarcerated people. And yet their emergency plans rely on exploiting the labor of those incarcerated. This has to stop. Just Leadership USA has launched the Just Us campaign, comprised of federal and state-based policies that focus on decarceration and safety. Just Us is a national call for policymakers to acknowledge the human dignity of people on the inside. These recommendations require all pipelines of the criminal justice system, from courts to jails to law enforcement, to act in sync to decarcerate and to provide proper access to emergency supplies, medical treatment, and education to those still inside, to save lives. In order to create an equitable system, the voices of those most impacted must be centered. No one deserves to die behind bars. Your voice is needed to protect the lives of those who cannot speak for themselves.